I am honored to introduce our speaker, Professor Lori Grant Hale of Augsburg University in Minneapolis. She is a graduate, PhD graduate of the University of Virginia and is a noted authority on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer, as you may know, was a well-known Lutheran pastor and theologian during the late 20s, 30s, early 40s, who was executed by the Nazis very late in World War II. There is an extensive bio of Professor Grant Hale in your program. Tonight, Dr. Hale will examine and help us to understand that what we believe should matter in all aspects of our lives. Balancing believing and acting on one's beliefs is exemplified clearly by the life and death of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a modern martyr and an example for all of us. So without further ado, let us give a warm welcome to Professor Lori Grant Hale.
Thank you so much. I'm just absolutely delighted to be here. I'm mostly delighted to be here with you this evening to talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and be part of this important series. I'm also delighted to be in this weather. So I'm going to jump in and read several passages from Bonhoeffer right out of the gate. And then I'm going to stop and say some introductory remarks, both about what I'm going to do this evening and my own context and that kind of thing. So here's Bonhoeffer, 1906 to 1945. If you do the math, 39 years old when he was executed. Later on, I discovered, and I'm still discovering to this day, that one only learns to have faith by living in the full this-worldliness of life. This is what I call this worldliness. Living fully in the midst of life's tasks, questions, successes and failures, experiences and perplexities. Then one takes seriously no longer one's own sufferings, but rather the sufferings of God in the world. Then one stays awake with Christ in Gethsemane, and I think this is faith. This is metanoia, or transformation. And this is how one becomes a human, a Christian. He wrote these words in a letter to his best friend, Eberhard Bethke, in his prison cell in Berlin, in Tegel prison on July 21st, 1944, the day after a failed attempt on Hitler's life. 18 months or so earlier, Bonhoeffer had written a letter of moral support to other members of the Canaris Oster conspiracy titled An Account at the turn of the year 1942 to 1943. The essay is also known as After 10 Years. It marks 10 years of Hitler's reign in Germany, and in it, Bonhoeffer asked rhetorically, who stands firm? He already knew the answer to the question, his companions in the conspiracy. The ones called by God to obedience and responsible action. They were living in a time, he claimed, when the huge masquerade of evil has thrown all ethical concepts into confusion, that evil should appear in the form of light, good deeds, historical necessity. Social justice is absolutely bewildering for one coming from the world of ethical concepts that we have received. Nonetheless, Bonhoeffer was committed to an optimism that he called will for the future. And he wrote, there are people who think optimism is frivolous, and Christians who think it impious to hope for a better future on earth and to prepare for it. They believe in chaos, disorder, and catastrophe, perceiving it in what is happening now. They withdraw in resignation or pious flight from the world, from the responsibility of ongoing life, for building anew for the coming generations. It may be that the day of judgment will dawn tomorrow. Only then, and no earlier, will we readily lay down our work for a better future. So I wanted to start with these passages because these are the passages that keep me coming back to Bonhoeffer. These are the ideas he has about faith, about living in the midst of life, in responsibility, and in suffering, in joy, in perplexity, in the messiness of it all. And so I wanted to sort of start here. I wanted to start with his understanding that you have to pay attention, that it's about responsibility, that faith is about living in this world and making this life a better place for future generations. So, with that sort of formal introduction, I just want to say again how honored I am to be here. I know you've been here, lots of you, for 6 weeks. This is the 6th week. And so tonight I have been asked to come and speak to you about this legacy of this Lutheran pastor living and writing and eventually dying in the context of Nazi Germany. I sometimes, when I come do these events, I get invited to church adult education forums and community associations, right? And I usually have an hour, sometimes 45 minutes, and I say, well, I hope you're settled in because sometimes I teach a whole semester on Bonhoeffer, and so I get about 50 hours worth of material. I will try not to keep you here for 50 hours, I know. Although, again, I would like to stay in Florida for a bit longer. So here's what I'm going to do tonight. I'm going to introduce the kind of overview of his life and his theological legacy. Because, and this is tricky, because even just in talking with some of you before we started, some of you know a lot about Bonhoeffer, and some of you have never heard of Bonhoeffer. Is that a fair assessment of the situation? Right. So I'm going to try to hit that middle ground where if you've never heard of Bonhoeffer, you get a pretty good understanding of who he was and what he was about. And if you know a lot about Bonhoeffer, I hope to either help you connect some dots or maybe get a new insight or something that you haven't heard before. So I want to do a little bit of an overview. Then I want to talk a little bit about the fact that Bonhoeffer is both used and abused in all sorts of public discourse these days, right? So we've got all kinds of both academic and public conversations happening about Bonhoeffer and his legacy, and there are some challenges and problems with that conversation. And that will lead us into then this question, which is really, I think, the generative question for us tonight. Is this a Bonhoeffer moment? And what does that mean, right? How do we even unpack that? One of the challenges of reading Bonhoeffer is recognizing that even though he gives us this amazing life and example and martyrdom even, how do we take the lessons from his life and apply them to our own context and our own questions? Because it's not a template that we can just kind of take from one situation to the other. We have to be really careful about how we do that. So that's one thing. The other thing I just want to acknowledge is that I recognize that my invitation tonight is from the Venice Interfaith Community Association, and that so not everybody in this room comes from the same theological or faith community background, right? So we have a lot of different starting points, and I don't want to make any assumptions about what those might be. Bonhoeffer is a Christian Lutheran theologian. He's writing specifically out of that context. So I'm not going to try to gloss over that. I'm going to talk out of that context. I want you to recognize or understand that I myself at Augsburg University am really excited to be in a very pluralistic interfaith context there. Our student demographic has changed beautifully in the last 20 years, and so we are a faith-based and ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, church-related college that invites and welcomes students from all sorts of faith traditions and humanist traditions and not faith traditions, of every kind of, persuasion. And so I just want to honor that and tell you that I'm cognizant then that we're talking specifically tonight about a Christian theologian. However, I'm actually doing some work myself right now. I'm thinking about how Bonhoeffer can be used constructively, how I can think alongside Bonhoeffer to think about interfaith work. He was very involved in ecumenical circles, so denominational circles within the Christian tradition. He did not do interfaith work. That wasn't in front of him during his lifetime. So what would it look like to maybe think about that work now? But we're not there yet, so I haven't. That's the next invitation. I'm going to look over at the board. Again, I'm going to try to give you a good sense of things. I want you to understand I'm going to have to gloss over some things and simplify some things, and if there's something you want me to circle back to in the conversation at the end, then I'd be happy to do that. So, now we go on. So this is a picture of Bonhoeffer, his siblings, and his mother. They were a very close-knit family. There were seven siblings. They came from a very upper-middle-class family. His father was a highly educated psychiatrist, neuroscientist. He taught at the University of Berlin. His mother also was highly educated. She did quite a bit of teaching of the children at home. They were nominally Christian. They were probably more political than they were religious, so they didn't attend church very often. And I want to point, this is a picture, so all 8 siblings are in this picture. If I go to this picture, the youngest sister is not yet born. And I just put this picture up for a moment. It's kind of hard to pick up Bonhoeffer. He's still a preschooler here, so there he is. Next to his twin sister, Sabina. They were in play clothes. And, but I want to point out, this is his older brother, Walter. And I mentioned Walter because Walter, when Dietrich was 11, he and his twin sister were 11, Walter went off to fight in World War I, was sent to the front, and 2 weeks after he left home, he was killed in action. Bonhoeffer's mother went into a deep depression. It had a very strong impact on the family, and it really sort of gave rise to Bonhoeffer asking a lot of existential questions about life and death. He and his sister started having conversations that I think most 11-year-olds probably didn't have. And this drove his interest in theology. So when he was a teenager, he announced to his family that he was going to study theology, that he was going to pursue this interest. And his father, who was a scientist, his older brothers were scientists, they were a little surprised by this. Not entirely happy, actually. But his father said, well, I've trained my children to be independent thinkers, so if you're going to do this, you should go ahead and do it. His brothers just made fun of him because that's what brothers do. And they said, well, the church is dying, the church is dead. He said, well, then I'll reform it. So, of course, he got busy. He was a very smart guy. It was said by some of his friends that he could do in 2 hours what took most people 10. And so by the time he was 21 years of age, he had finished his doctoral dissertation. Yeah, I was not 21 when I finished my doctoral dissertation. So this is the dissertation that he wrote, Sanctorum Communio, the Communion of Saints. And in this, it's a sociological, theological, historical exploration of the church. And one of the ideas that he explored in this work was this idea of the ongoing incarnation of Christ. So again, if you start in the Christian tradition, and according to the Christian tradition, you understand Jesus as the revelation of God in the world, self-revelation of God. Bonhoeffer said, well, where does that continue to happen? Where do we continue to find the ongoing revelation of God in the world? And he decided it was in community. It was in our relationships with one another. And so he started to think about these ideas. He also, in this dissertation, posited the idea that when you encounter another, that other places an ethical demand on you, right? That's an important piece that we're going to we're going to come back to as his theology develops over time. So there's really this sort of chronological development of his theology over time, and this is the first piece that happens in the dissertation. After he finished his dissertation in 1927, he became the pastor of an expatriate German church in Barcelona, Spain. So he went to Spain for a year. He was the associate pastor. He delivered a bunch of sermons and some lectures. And I want to make a note of this because if you take a look at those presentations, there's a tension that you see in his theology that's gonna take a big experience to kind of work this out. So on one hand, he's already exploring these ideas of the incarnation of Christ, the ongoing incarnation of Christ in community. And if you think about that, eventually that's going to lead to, sort of ways that emulating Christ, forming yourself after Christ, we're going to talk about this when we get to his ethics, allows for some sensitivity to social justice issues. At the same time, he had some of the same sensibilities and even wounds that other Germans had after World War I. Right? So there was a strong sort of sympathy toward German nationalism that was happening in post-World War I Germany. And it was shaped by kind of a European triumphalist theology. And so this isn't going to shift until the next year when he goes to New York City to study at Union Theological Seminary. So, 1930, 1931, he gets a Sloan Fellowship to go study at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And I'm going to spend some time talking about his time in New York because I think it is almost impossible to overstate the importance of his experience in New York for the development of his thinking, his choices, and his theology. So, when he arrived, one of his professors was Reinhold Niebuhr. Does this name ring a bell to some of you? Okay, lots of you. Fantastic. So I'm going to make this a little interactive. So when I say Reinhold Niebuhr, what are some things that come to mind? Oh, okay. Give us a bit more. Serenity prayer. Moral man and moral society. Christ and culture. That's actually H. Richard Niebuhr. So Reinhold Niebuhr is often considered the father of modern social ethics, right? And so if you know, again, we know the end of Bonhoeffer's story. We know that Bonhoeffer is going to get involved in the conspiracy that's main goal is to take out Hitler. We know that he's going to be an enemy of the Nazi state. We know he's going to be executed. And so it would seem when he encounters Reinhold Niebuhr initially that he would be really drawn to the kinds of things that he was saying. That was not the case at all. His first semester at Union, he was highly disappointed. He felt like the academics weren't rigorous. He felt like the gospel wasn't being taught in any recognizable form. He thought that the student-faculty relationships were far too familiar. He was, in general, fairly disappointed. He'd come from this very structured, rigorous German academy, and Union was everything that was. I mean, like, they were just opposite. And so he wrote some letters home saying, yeah, this is not so great. I'm paraphrasing there. It takes some friendships and some relationships and experience while he's there to start to reshape the way he's understanding what he's learning in the classroom. And to come by the second semester to a great appreciation for what he's learning and what he has the opportunity to learn both at Union and in the city. So one of his friendships, and I can't, again, there are many, some very close friendships. I'm only going to talk about two. So one of his friendships was with a fellow student named Jean Lasserre, who was a French student, a pacifist. And of course, their friendship in this time, in 1930, after World War I, was highly unusual. Germany and France would not have been on friendly terms at this point in time, to put it mildly. And so they struck up this very close friendship. And in the process of that, Lassalle planted some ideas that were, again, important ideas. He suggested, for example, that the Sermon on the Mount from the Gospel of Matthew should be read differently than the way Bonhoeffer was accustomed to reading it. So Bonhoeffer, coming out of the Lutheran tradition, would have understood, so this includes the Beatitudes. So if you're not familiar, this might ring some bells for some of you. Blessed are the poor, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek. So the Beatitudes kind of turn upside down our expectations about who should be in power, who should be on top, how things should be going in the world. And so Bonhoeffer, coming out of the Lutheran tradition, would have been presented with this message in the Bible as a way of either thinking about the kingdom of God to come, like what's to come, this is an hoped-for ideal that we can get to at the end of time, or as a reminder of how far humanity falls short, right? That we can't quite get there, that it reminds us of our innate sinfulness, and so, we're dependent on God for our salvation and for mercy. Lassalle said, I think this is how we're supposed to live. I think Jesus wanted us to live this way, right? So that was an idea that was planted by Lassalle that had a significant impact on Bonhoeffer. He's going to encounter it again before he leaves New York, and I'll say something about that in a minute. He also developed a very close friendship with another student, the African-American student in the light-colored jacket, the second row, second from the left. That is Albert Franklin Fisher, student at Union from Alabama. And Dietrich and Al Fisher became, again, very, very close friends. And so this is where the story gets really interesting and really important. So through his friendship with Al Fisher, he got involved at the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. This was a big African-American church, built by African-Americans, not sort of a hand-me-down church that they had sort of taken over. Very vibrant worship experience. Adam Clayton Powell was the senior pastor. They were very cognizant in their preaching about the relationship of the gospel and what was happening in the world. Right? There was a close tie. And so all of these things were different. Bonhoeffer had never experienced worship in this kind of visceral, call and response, energetic, beautiful way. He was drawn in by the music that was being sung there. So these were gospel music based on African-American spirituals that, again, tied together the gospel with concrete reality. Those things came together in that music. I failed to mention when he was a child, one of the other reasons his family was surprised that he chose to pursue theology was because he was a very accomplished musician. He was a very accomplished pianist. Everyone thought he would be a professional musician. And so, he was playing classical stuff. By the time he was 12, he could play all of the things you would consider important pieces, from Renaissance and Baroque periods and that kind of thing. But he was but music was a language that he spoke, and so this language of music and the message of the music spoke to him. So that was another case. Again, this emphasis on the relationship of what was happening in church and what was happening outside of church was critical. So there was a place right outside the door, this main door of the church, where they could hang banners. This is 1930s America. There were horrible things happening at this time, including lynchings were still happening at this time. So if that happened, there was a banner that went outside the church door. It said, "A man was lynched today." Because that is the responsibility of people who preach the gospel, to pay attention to that, to do something about that, to change that. So So at Abyssinian, Bonhoeffer found Christ existing as community, right? We talked about that in the dissertation. He found it happening where historically marginalized and oppressed people, Black people in this community, knew Jesus as their co-sufferer. And the gospel spoke to all aspects of life. So I want to read you a passage. My colleague Reggie Williams has written a book that I highly recommend called Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. And it's about his encounter with the Harlem Renaissance and the ethic of resistance that Bonhoeffer developed out of this encounter. So Reggie writes, most white liberals failed to see white supremacy as a matter for Christian attention. And as a consequence, they ignored the constant dangers of daily life in America for Black people. But avoiding racism was not a choice for African American Christians. It was a matter of life and death in a society organized by race and enforced by violence. Consequently, Bonhoeffer's friendship with Albert Fisher introduced him to Christian worship with an inherently different view of society. With Fisher, Bonhoeffer encountered Christians aware of human suffering and accustomed to living with the threat of death in a society organized by a violent white supremacy. Bonhoeffer's time at Abyssinian, his friendship with Frank Fisher, his encounter with the literature, the poetry of those working that are part of what's known as the Harlem Renaissance, changed his point of view. He had a transformation of consciousness and started seeing what he's going to describe later in Letters and Papers from Prison as the view from below. Right? That the point, the most appropriate way to look at things from society is from the view of those who are suffering in our outcome. It's this experience in New York that really gave him this ability to sort of transform his starting point for thinking about what it meant to be in relationship with others, to encounter others, and to see Christ in the world, like where Christ is operating. So we have on this slide Countee Cullen, W.E.B. Du Bois, Elaine Locke, George Mackay, Georgia Douglas Johnson, and Langston Hughes. And so if you want to read more about this, I would highly recommend Dr. Williams' book, Reggie's book on Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. He goes through, there's a whole section where he talks about the poetry from these different figures and how they specifically made an impact on Bonhoeffer's theological thinking. So his year in New York ended. He was there 1930-31. He went back to Berlin. He was ordained at St. Matthew's Church in Berlin. He specifically sought out places to work in Berlin that were, again, sort of, if you want to say, the places that reminded him of his work in Abyssinian. So he sought out work with people who were struggling, with people who were not privileged. He really started to recognize, this is another way to frame it, right? He started to recognize his own privilege and started to use that as a way to understand his own responsibility in the community, right? So he did this. Now, we're up to 1931. Again, I told you we're going to have to gloss a few things for purposes of time. So, sorry, I keep forwarding both of the slides here. So, we need to do a little historical context, right? When did Hitler come to power? I heard somebody, 1933, January 30th of 1933. When I ask my students this question, they typically think about the war and the Holocaust, and they think like late 30s, early 40s. But I hear you saying, knowing right, that 1933, January 30th, 1933. And again, just briefly, what do we know about what happened to Germany after World War I? Yeah, I hear all of it, right? So I hear They were blamed for the war. They had to pay reparations. They were forced in the Versailles Treaty to close military manufacturing. People were out of work. They were stripped of everything. That's right. There was sort of humiliation and then financial difficulty. And that's an understatement, right? People were literally starving. I'm not trying to justify Hitler's rise to power, but I am trying to put it in context. Right? People were they were trying to feed their families. And Hitler comes along. He's very charismatic, and he says, "I will put you back to work, and I know who's to blame." Right? Because when military manufacturing shuts down, then other manufacturing, those people are out of work, the economy starts to tank, then other manufacturing shuts down. And so who's left working? People in the service industry, tailors and bankers and bakers. And at this time, historically in Germany, who held those jobs? Jewish families, right? The Jewish community. So he's like, I'll put you back to work, and I'll tell you who's to blame. People are like, okay, great. He started right away with the program of dehumanizing the Jewish community. So April 1st of 1933, you have the Jewish boycott. The Jewish boycott. So stores throughout Germany were marked if they were owned by Jews. People were told not to shop there. There were guards placed outside. Dietrich Bonhoeffer's grandmother, who was in her 80s, said, "I will shop where I always shop." And she marched past the guards, and they weren't quite sure what to do with her because she was determined to go in, and so they let her go in, and she bought her bread, and she left. And I mention that because it reminds us that Bonhoeffer had some very strong members of his family. He had some role models about what it looked like to resist. Right? So that happened. Also in 1933, the Aryan paragraph was adopted. So this is the paragraph that said, if you have any Jewish ancestry, you are no longer allowed to hold a public office. Right? It could be, and there was a formula for if it was one grandparent, or there was a way to figure this out. So Bonhoeffer delivered an address to a group of pastors. There was pastors starting to be concerned. They came together, and he delivered an address called "The Church and the Jewish Question." Now he's coming out of a tradition, a Lutheran tradition, that says the church and the state have separate spheres of separate sources of authority and separate spheres of responsibility. So the church is responsible for preaching the gospel, and the state is responsible for preserving order. And as long as those things are happening, they don't need to get in each other's way, right? So he gave this address that said, here's the thing. If the state fails to provide order, if it has too much law or too little law, the church has the right and the responsibility to speak up. If the state is creating victims, if the state is victimizing people, the church has the right and the responsibility to aid victims of the state, even if they're not Christian. And finally, if the state is failing in its job of preserving order, if it has too little order, too much order, if it's victimizing people, if all those things are happening, the church has the right and the responsibility to jam the spokes of the wheel of the state. So think about that. So sometimes this gets mistranslated, and people say that the church can put a spoke in the wheel of the state. Well, that doesn't make any sense. If you put a spoke in the wheel of the state, the wheel just keeps turning. The image is really you jam a spoke. You jam the spokes. I like to think of my brother on a bicycle, riding by, and I have a big stick, and I you jam the spokes, and what happens? The wheel stops. Brother goes blind on my handlebars, right? Sorry, Sam. This was radical. Now he's calling for direct political action, not necessarily violent political action, but civil disobedience, some kind of resistance. And this was so radical that all of the pastors in the room got up and left. They weren't ready for this message. Okay, so meantime, the Nazis have decided they want to form a national Reich church, a state church. They want to bring together all the Protestant churches who have been kind of operating independently and create a national right church. The Catholic Church has signed a concordat with the Nazis in the beginning of 1933 saying, if you stay out of our way, we'll stay out of your way. So they're kind of out of the picture. Again, that's a simplified version, but that's the basics. And now they want to form a national Reich church, and they want to elect Ludwig Müller as the bishop, who was a Nazi sympathizer. A group of pastors come together and form the Emergency Pastors League. They're interested in stopping the election. That doesn't happen. And so in July of 1933, Ludwig Müller becomes the National Reich Bishop of the German Christian Church, the Deutsche Kirche. By the fall of that year, the church also adopts language similar to the Aryan paragraph that says, if a pastor, a clergy person, has any Jewish ancestry, doesn't matter that they're a Christian, doesn't matter if they converted to Christianity, doesn't matter if they've been ordained, if they have any Jewish ancestry, they're no longer allowed to hold their office. So Bonhoeffer at this point isn't really sure what his role is. He's trying to sort this out. He's already started to get involved in the ecumenical movement in Europe, thinking about peacemaking, thinking about what it looks like to be where Christianity transcends national boundaries, right? So there's sort of a disconnect between that kind of German nationalism, for example, and Christian identity. He's trying to think about it in broader terms. Again, his time in New York started the ball rolling on that way of thinking. But he's not sure what he's supposed to do. So he takes what he calls like a retreat, kind of a retreat to the wilderness, but it's to London. And so he takes, this is actually not one of the churches he pastored. This is a church he preached at. The churches he pastored were destroyed, were damaged during the war. But he went to London for 2 years and was kind of sorting out what he needed to do, what his role in Germany should be, as things were starting to get started there. And the church was being co-opted. It was a very difficult time already. This was 1934, 1935. While he was there, I'll just note, while he was there, if you look at his sermons, he was preaching extensively on the idea of loving one's enemies. And he was explicit. I mean, this was not an abstract idea. I mean, he didn't mention Hitler by name, but he was thinking, how do we overcome this evil through love? This was what he was trying to wrestle with. Meantime, he made arrangements to study nonviolent resistance with Gandhi in India. He was contemporary with Gandhi. He had connections through his friend Bishop George Bell in London with Gandhi. Everything was arranged to make this a possibility. And then this Emergency Pastors League that he had been part of in the meantime wrote the Varna Declaration and established the Confessing Church. So this is a break-off church from the German Christian Church. They said, we confess that Jesus Christ is Lord and no other. Of course, the unwritten subtext to that is, and not Hitler, right? And so they decided to open a seminary. And it was going to be illegal and underground, because again, there was this church-state relationship such that the seminaries that were part of the German Christian Church were state-run. So if you went to seminary on that track, you had to sign a loyalty oath to Hitler. So there were a whole bunch of young men at the time, young men who wanted to become pastors who did not want to sign that loyalty oath. So they decided to open a seminary in a place called Finkenwalde. They opened it in Zingst, and then it got moved to this place called Finkenwalde. And they asked Dietrich to come be the director of the seminary. So now he had to decide, study with Gandhi or direct the seminary. And if you know his story, you know that he decided to go to the seminary. So he got there, and again, I'm just looking at my time. I need to speed up, or we're not going to get to all the things. Like I said, I have 50 hours worth of stuff, right? Okay. So, all right. Okay. Well, I would have some time for questions and answers, so I will pick up the pace. I won't talk any faster. I'll just try to pick up the pace a little bit. He became really close friends with one of the first students there, Eberhard Becker. Remember, he had finished his dissertation when he was so young that he was about the same age as the seminarians. So Eberhard Beckmann came, they became close friends, he became his sort of theological confidant, and he's going to eventually become his biographer, so we'll talk about Eberhard a little bit. While he was at the seminary, he wrote Discipleship. So if those of you who are familiar with Bonhoeffer, you may be familiar, this is one of his more famous books. You may know it as The Cost of Discipleship. The original German title is Nachfolger, following after, which is what it means to be a disciple, and so the new translation of the English editions of Bonhoeffer's work is called Discipleship. The original translators, I think, were trying to get in the title this main idea of this text, where he talks about costly grace. And so, this is something we could spend 20 minutes talking about costly grace, but we won't do that. Basically, it's this idea that grace is a gift from God. This is a Christian idea, right? That grace is a gift from God. And in the Catholic tradition, in the Augustinian tradition, that gift is transformative. It transforms your thinking, your willing and believing, so that you can act in such a way as to be righteous in the eyes of God. When Martin Luther came along, he struggled with this, because he thought you had to do all this good works before you could be righteous, and that you couldn't have faith until you were righteous, and he went to confession. He was Catholic, he went to confession every day, and finally came to the conclusion that that gift of grace is unmerited forgiveness. You could never do enough or be enough to earn it. So it's a gift of absolute forgiveness. This is where you get the Protestant, we are justified by faith through grace alone, right? This formulation of this idea. So Bonhoeffer comes along and says, you know what? There's critiques. If you push the original Augustinian version of this too far, it means you have to earn your own salvation. Works righteousness, you've heard that, right? But if you take Luther's position and push it to its extreme, everybody's off the hook. You're lazy, you don't have to do anything. So Bonhoeffer wanted to bring that a little bit in the middle, right? So he started with that Lutheran understanding that grace is an unmerited gift of forgiveness, but it does in fact transform how you live your life. That's costly grace, in a nutshell. This is important because when he later becomes part of the conspiracy, he really leans heavily into this idea of grace, because at the end of the day, he never says that assassination or tyrannicide is justified. He always says it's a sin. That when he writes to his co-conspirators about getting involved in this action, he says, we're taking on guilt. We think we're called by God to do this, but we have to hope and pray for God to forgive us when we become sinners in that venture. Right? So he leans heavily into that understanding of costly grace. So, 1937, the seminary is closed by the Gestapo. Shut, padlocked shut. Bonhoeffer goes away and writes a book, another book that you might have heard of. Again, if you've studied Bonhoeffer, this is another one of his kind of famous books called Life Together, where it's his account of the time at the seminary. How they ordered the day, how they structured their time together, what it meant for him to be in community and to create community among the seminarians. I will note the theme that I mentioned earlier about how quickly he could work. He wrote this book in 6 weeks. He had a very structured order of the day for the seminarians: a time to pray, a time to eat, a time to work, a time alone, a time together. He was criticized for this. People said, why are you trying to monasticize these seminarians, right? So, when some religious orders, whether you talk about Catholic monks or nuns or Buddhist monks or nuns, right, they typically withdraw from the world, right? They come out and withdraw. So people saying, why are you trying to monasticize these seminarians by creating this very structured day that looks very much like a monastery? He says, I'm trying to give them resources for spiritual renewal and community development, so when they go back into the very difficult context of Nazi Germany, to have parishes, to lead communities, that they can do the work that they need to do, because it's going to be difficult work. So that's what he was trying to do. I think he also was taking those ideas he talked about in the dissertation, those ideas of Christ existing as community, which were very abstract, and saying, here's how you sustain that. He hadn't given us any thought about how to sustain that. Here's how you sustain that in relationship, in dialogue, in confession to one another, in these practices that will allow people to create these sort of deep experiences of community that will be so necessary in the very difficult work, again, difficult work of resistance happening in those parishes in the middle of Nazi Germany. So, November 9th, 1938. Is this a familiar date? I heard Kristallnacht, right? The night of breaking glass. So this is the night where all over Germany, synagogues, Jewish businesses, homes were vandalized, destroyed, people died. It was very orchestrated. It was very horrific. It was very upsetting to Bonhoeffer. Sorry. Apologize. And so, this is another, I think this marks another turning point in his thinking. If you look at his work prior to this point, he was still writing about loving one's enemies. After this time, he dropped that language almost completely and started talking instead about responsible action. Okay? So meantime, he's being drafted, he's refusing the draft, he has family members who are already sort of in the conspiracy. He's afraid he's going to draw attention to them if he continues to refuse to serve in the German army. He has friends in the United States who are concerned about him. So they make arrangements, Reinhold Niebuhr among them, for him to come back to the United States. And so in June of 1939, he arrives in New York. He has papers in order. He has lectureships sort of lined up, everything for him to stay in the States. The war hadn't started yet. It was imminent. But he could have stayed safely here for the duration of the war. But he never felt settled. He never felt like that's where he should be. He felt like there was this crisis coming. There was going to be work to be done after the crisis, work in Germany, work for the church. And that if he was going to be part of the reconstruction, he had to be part of the crisis with his family and friends. So he only stayed for a month, and in July of 1939, he went back and took the last ship before they closed the Atlantic crossing. So this is a Benedictine monastery in Bavaria where he spent some time writing. This is a plaque that talks about that. When he went back, he started working on his ethics, and he developed a couple of ideas. Really that had been present from the beginning of his work, but he really started to develop them. So one is this idea of Stellvertretung. Very difficult German word to translate. In fact, in earlier English editions, it was translated as deputyship, which, I don't know what that means exactly. So in the new critical English language editions of all of Bonhoeffer's work, it's translated as vicarious representative action. So again, if you start with the Christian understanding that Jesus Christ died vicariously on behalf of all humanity, then to follow after Christ, to be a disciple of Christ, means that we are called to act vicariously on behalf of those who have lost their power, lost their voice, have no way to act on their own behalf. So this is a theme that, again, resonates with that sort of shift of consciousness that he had in Harlem, where he started seeing things from the perspective of those who are suffering, for those who are outcasts. And so that part of what it means to live in this world is to see from that perspective. He also developed an idea of vocation as responsibility, and he talked about ethics as formation, being formed after the example of Christ. Again, in a very brief way, most ethical systems, if you read other ethicists, try to sort of come up with ethical principles that are good for all times and all places. Bonhoeffer said, you can't do that. He said, we have to pay attention to concrete reality and concrete people and situations in front of us and respond. And it's not going to be the case very often that there's a clear choice between a clear good and a clear evil. It's a lot messier than that. And so, we have to be more nimble in what that looks like. And we have a guide. He didn't want to swing the pendulum all the way to sort of situational ethics because he wanted to have it grounded. He wanted it grounded in Christ. So there was this fad that went around for a while. The teenagers especially wore the bracelets, the WWJD, what would Jesus do, right? Well, okay, I don't want to discourage any teenager from trying to think about good choices, right? I think that's great. The problem with that is that in a lot of situations that we face now, we don't know what Jesus would do because there's no anecdote or story that tells us because our situation is different, our context is different. We don't know what Jesus would do, but we do know ways that Jesus interacted with people. We know that he talked to people who were outcast. We know that he broke Sabbath laws if it meant if he needed to help somebody, he wasn't going to let a law about the Sabbath prevent him from helping somebody. Right? We know that he recognized the humanity in everybody, and that can be a way to form ourselves after him in thinking about what it looks like to act on behalf of someone else, what it looks like to act responsibly, to take responsible action in the world. Okay, so so Bonhoeffer, when he came back from New York, I think he came back knowing full well that he needed to get involved in the conspiracy. So he had brothers and brothers-in-law who were already involved. His brother-in-law, Anton Donati, was a highly placed official in the German military intelligence, and they had been keeping track of all of the crimes against humanity that Hitler had been perpetrating since he took office. They were paying attention. They were hoping they might prosecute him in some kind of international tribunal. And so Bonhoeffer got named as a double agent for the Abwehr, the German military intelligence. And on the sort of, ostensibly, he was using his ecumenical contacts throughout Europe to spy for Germany. What he was actually doing was he was making those contacts, but he was trying to negotiate terms of peace and surrender should the coup be successful. He was getting no traction with that, by the way. For example, the parliament in England said, you can clean house in Germany all you want. We're not going to make any promises in advance about how we're going to interact with you if that's the case. In the meantime, the Abwehr helped a handful, about a dozen or so Jews escape Germany, named them as agents of the Abwehr, gave them traveling papers and money, and helped them escape to Switzerland. So in April of 1943, Bonhoeffer was arrested on very tenuous charges related to that. It was called Operation 7. Again, they were very tenuous charges. The Gestapo started investigating the Abwehr, thinking they were financially corrupt. This financial transaction raised their attention. They did not know about the conspiracy. So this is his parents' home. Not the home he grew up in, but the home that they had when he was older. He had a study and a room here. And this is where he was when he was arrested. It was just a few months before that, before he was arrested in December of 1942, that he wrote this essay I mentioned at the beginning of the evening, After 10 Years. So Hitler's been in power for 10 years. There's this handful of people who are trying to take action and make a difference. And it's very much a letter of moral support and kind of a rhetorical set of questions about how do we make sense of this? What's going on? Who's standing fast? Why are we the only ones who are recognizing this masquerade of evil, this facade that is presented to us as necessary, it's presented to us as justice? We got to see through that. We got to recognize that. He did get engaged. That's another story we can talk about next time I come back. There's me. Like there's a study in the house. That's me sitting at his desk. It was a very exciting day. This is where he was in prison. So once he was arrested, he was taken to prison in Berlin, not to a concentration camp. When he was there, he was there for a year and a half or more, and he did a lot of writing from there. So the letters and papers from prison, the first year or so when he was there, it was mostly letters to his family, to his parents, to his brothers, and they were very almost mundane, right? They could bring him things, so it would be like, I need this, I like this book, I would like this pair of pants, and I would like some cigarettes, stuff like that. They had developed a code for communicating with each other. So in any book that he requested, there would be little pencil dots above letters. Maybe one letter every couple of pages, so it would take a whole book for like a sentence, just so they could keep track of what was happening, who knew what, who they were being interrogated, and again, he had family members also involved in conspiracies. So So that was happening. All of those letters were subject to censorship. They only wrote them every 10 days. They went through all the official channels. They realized, though, that after about a year, he was not going to get out. Again, the charges were tenuous. They were looking for a reason to keep him. And so he started writing what we would talk about as the more theologically interesting letters sort of after the first year. Those letters were to and from his friend Everhard Bethke. Those letters were smuggled in and out of prison by a friendly guard. And those are the letters where he starts to work out this idea at the end of his life called religionless Christianity, or this worldly Christianity. So he says, look, if religion is sort of the garment of Christianity, the trappings, the things that change over time, what if we strip this down? He had been highly disappointed by the church. The German church that had been co-opted by the Nazis, the confessing church, which at the end of the day was silent after Kristallnacht and stopped supporting people who didn't want to sign the loyalty oath to Hitler. He felt completely let down by the church. Now, he still was very devoted to a variety of what we call religious practices. He read the Bible every day, he sang hymns in his cell, he prayed, but he felt like he needed to get to the sort of the essence of Christianity, and he started thinking about how the world had come of age, that questions that were normally questions for religion, a time when people were automatically religious, was gone. The Industrial Revolution had happened, there had been advances in science. If you went outside and looked at the stars, at the heavens, you didn't go to church and ask about the mystery and awe. You went to scientists, you went to physicists, you talked to an astronomer. He said, but this is good news, because in that old way of thinking, God had only been understood as the Deus ex machina, the God is machine, the God who swoops down and solves the problems, right? This is from Greek theater, and then swoops away. And as our knowledge expands, and we don't need God to answer those unanswered questions, that idea of God just keeps getting pushed further and further on the boundaries of our life. He said that's a false concept of God. For him, remember, he wanted to look back to where do we find God? He said in the Bible, he said we find God in weakness and suffering. God comes into the world as a human, as a baby. God stays with people in the midst of their lives. That's where he wanted to talk about God. He says, with God and before God, we live without God. We go about our day-to-day lives et se Deus non deiter, as if there were no God. And so he said, this is what he wants to talk about, this worldly Christianity, where, he's not sort of dismissing the possibility of an eternal life. He's not sort of undoing all of that theological work, but he's saying, I want to work for a better earthly future. Again, that's the passage I read at the beginning of the night. It's my calling, my faith to be, it's whole, it's the whole of my life. And it's about making this world a better place. That's why it's this worldly Christianity. He was part of the group, that's the famous July 20th, 1944, bomb in the briefcase under the table. Colonel von Stauffenberg was the one who placed the bomb. If you've seen the movie Valkyrie, this is the story, right? This is the Tom Cruise character. So once that happened, the briefcase was placed under the table. So Bonhoeffer had been in prison for a year and a half. He went in April of 1943. This is July 20th of 1944. And so the bomb detonated. It destroyed the bunker. Some people were killed. Some people were hurt. Hitler was not hurt. He saw it as an indication that God was on his side, that he was doing what he was supposed to do, and he should continue the program, right? But because of who was at that meeting, they realized it was an inside job. So a full-scale investigation was launched. That dossier of I talked about, they were keeping track of all of Hitler's crimes against humanity. They had debated, should we destroy it, should we hide it? Well, they hid it, but they didn't hide it well enough. So it was discovered, and everybody who had been involved was implicated, including Dietrich. And so after that happened, he was then moved a couple of times. He ended up at Buchenwald for a while, not in the concentration camp, but in some barracks, some SS barracks. These are the ruins of the barracks that were prison cells in the basement. And then eventually to Flossenburg concentration camp, where he was executed on April 9th of 1945. There was a 2-week period where his brother-in-law, Hans Viginani, his brother-in-law, Rudiger Schleicher, his brother Klaus, and Colonel Hans Oster were all also executed. They were all part of that years. So the Bonhoeffer family lost 2 sons and 2 sons-in-law in a matter of 2 weeks in April of 45, about 2 weeks before the war ended. This is Eberhard Bethke, his best friend. He died in the year 2000. This picture was taken not too long before that. This is his wife, Renata, who also was very instrumental in sort of making Bonhoeffer's works known. Renata is also Dietrich Bonhoeffer's niece. There was a big age difference. She is actually still alive. She's in poor health, but she is still alive. This is Bonhoeffer at Westminster Abbey. There's a wall of 20th century martyrs. Now here's the thing, and I want to spend maybe like another 5 or 6 minutes talking, and then I'll leave us about 15 minutes for questions. Does that sound right? Okay. So here's an observation from Christiane Tietz. She is the president of the German language section of the Bonhoeffer. There's multiple international Bonhoeffer societies. There's a German language section. There's an English language section. I'm the vice president of the English language section. There's a section in Brazil. There's a section in Japan. So people are interested in Bonhoeffer all over the world. She says, when one observes the reception of Bonhoeffer, it is immediately striking to see how strongly people from very different theological backgrounds and sectors of the Christian world have adopted him for their own purposes. So you can take sort of a really wide swath of folks who identify as Christian in a lot of different ways, and they all have kind of adopted Bonhoeffer as their own. And so one of my good friends, colleagues, he and I actually co-wrote a book, sorry, I keep advancing this one and not this one. Steve Haynes and I actually co-wrote a book called Bonhoeffer for Armchair Theologians about 10 years ago. But he just has a book that just came out this last year called The Battle for Bonhoeffer. And in it, he talks about the ways that there are these sort of competing portraits of Bonhoeffer. So radical, liberal, evangelical, universal, populist, and sort of this polarization of his legacy. And so it's this populist version of Bonhoeffer that is becoming really prominent right now in this country. So now again, populism, it's this word, and my students, need some reminders, right? It's a political approach that appeals to ordinary people who feel their concerns have been disregarded by sort of the established elite. So if you think about how that sort of plays out in political discourse, it plays out even in the reception of Bonhoeffer. So there's an interpreter of Bonhoeffer right now who has basically worked pretty hard to dismiss all academic research on Bonhoeffer and present his own version. I'll come to that in just a minute. You can find Bonhoeffer, you can find scholarly work, you can find books, you can find plays and novels, and there's a musical being written right now, and operettas, and all sorts of things. There have been, again, there's businesses. I could give you many, many examples. There's actually, let me see, I gotta give you this one example, I gotta look at it though. In Nashua, New Hampshire, there's a place called Bonhoeffer's Espresso and Cafe, serving direct trade coffee with a mission. There's another group, I can't remember the exact name of the organization, but there's a group, and when you first read about it, it sounds pretty exciting. There's a group of folks who kind of got frustrated with institutional churches, and they've created these sort of Bonhoeffer circles, these Bonhoeffer groups. And again, when you start reading about their program, I'm like, wow, this is kind of interesting. And then you get to the part where, and for $3,000, you can join their group. And I'm like, oh, maybe not, right? So here's the thing. One of the ironic features, again, this is from Steve's book, he says, all this points to an ironic feature of Bonhoeffer's American reception. The better he is known, the greater the number and variety of sources through which the public is likely to encounter Bonhoeffer, the more difficult it becomes to keep misconceptions and misquotes from spreading. Right, so I just want to give you an example. Have you seen this quote? Silence in the face of evil is evil itself. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. There's a chance if you look up Bonhoeffer, if you Google Bonhoeffer, you're going to find this quote. Bonhoeffer did not say this. Now, I get it. It's in the ballpark, right? I mean, it's not completely unrelated to the things that he said. But he didn't say it. However, Eric Metaxas, he's the one I mentioned. He's a best-selling biographer. He's not a scholar. He wrote a book about Bonhoeffer. I'm going to go ahead and... So this is Metaxas' book. Have you seen this book?
Yes.
It was a New York Times bestseller. Metaxas is an evangelical, extremely conservative, religiously, theologically, and politically writer. And he has co-opted Bonhoeffer to make him look like an American evangelical. And this quote is on the dust jacket of his book, which is why I got. No, it's a double-edged sword because on one hand he gets a lot of stuff wrong. There's like more than 400 documented mistakes in his book, like errors, like factual errors about Bonhoeffer. But he writes beautifully, and people read his book, and he's introduced Bonhoeffer to a whole bunch of people who would have never heard or learned about Bonhoeffer any other way. But if you want to read a biography about Bonhoeffer, you should look at Bethke's biography, although it's 1,000 pages long. Charles Marsh's biography, Ferdinand Schlingensiepen, he's a German scholar. Those are some sort of hefty ones. There's some shorter ones. I think the list that I have that's on the website for Vika has a really short one by Christian Tietz. It's excellent. It's a great introduction. And these are based on 50 years of scholarship that Metaxas dismisses, right? He says they all got it wrong. So, is this the Bonhoeffer moment? Well, again, Metaxas introduced that language at the 2012 prayer breakfast. It got picked up by evangelicals in 2015 with the Supreme Court case around same-sex marriage. For the evangelical communities that were worried about that, it was the Bonhoeffer moment. And for some people, that's the Bonhoeffer moment. But then in 2016, Metaxas endorsed Trump in the name of Bonhoeffer. I'm going to be honest with you, I find that very problematic. I'm just going to say that. Others on the left and right, including David Brooks, who would be considered primarily a conservative thinker, right, repudiated Trump in the name of Bonhoeffer. So the International Bonhoeffer Society English Language section issued a statement in February of 2017. I can make that available to the Vika folks if you want to distribute it, or you can find it online at the Bonhoeffer Center website. Basically saying, here are some responsible ways to use Bonhoeffer. So sort of thinking through what it looks like to use Bonhoeffer responsibly. Here we go. And then various people have started to weigh in on this question, what is the Bonhoeffer moment? So my colleague Steve Haynes and then my colleague Reggie Williams and I have done that together. So I'm starting to lose my picture. That's okay. So 2 years ago, this is Reggie Williams in the middle, Jim Wallace on the right, and that's me. We were invited by Sojourners to come to Washington, D.C. to a summit and address this question, is this the Bonhoeffer moment? And so we had a sort of short Q&A, and of course, for some people that means, is this a question about violence? And some people, I mean, this is the problem, some people have used Bonhoeffer to justify taking violent action. Reggie and I have tried to reframe this. So there's an article that after we did this presentation, then we wrote an article for Sojourners addressing this question. And we've tried to reframe this and say, that's missing the point of Bonhoeffer, right? So that we think a better way that Bonhoeffer might have asked that question now, because again, we all want to know, at what point do we say enough is enough? At what point do we act? And how do we act? And so I think we concluded that one of the ways to ask the question that using Bonhoeffer's legacy to say, he would say, who is Christ for us today? And if you're not in the Christian tradition and that question is uncomfortable for you, you could reframe it to say, look around, who is suffering? And that if you can answer that question and think about what your responsibility is in relationship to that question, that might be the more productive way to think about the Bonhoeffer moment. So with a few minutes left to take questions, let me throw this back to you. What are your questions? Is this a Bonhoeffer moment? And, you know, he decided that he had to take action in his context, that it was no longer okay. So he moved, let me just, he moved from concern about the church being co-opted by the Nazis. He moved from sort of an affinity with German nationalism to an understanding of his own privilege and ways of thinking about the people on the underside of that privilege that needed his support. And he moved into a way of being in the world where he was acting on behalf of victims of the state. He was acting in solidarity with, and in that sort of vicarious representative way for people who had been imprisoned by the Nazis, were being executed by the Nazis, that they had no longer had a voice. So when people say to me, you know, how could he take on this action, this sinful action of trying to be involved in this conspiracy? I mean, one response to that is to act in the way that he acted. He understood that to act in the way that he acted was to take on guilt. And to not act was also to take on guilt. So, between a rock and a hard place, exactly. The hardest piece of this, then, is always, when we get to the end of this, and like, okay, this is this amazing example, the discernment question is always the hard one. We still have to discern what it is we're called to do, and what that looks like. So, that's what I have. Thank you.
Two mics, they're very sensitive. Brand new sound system, see?
Sorry.
So you only have to get 10 inches from it, and please don't touch it because it will scream. So we have a mic there and a mic here. Who's first?
I guess I'll just speak from back here at the survey. I guess I'd change that question. Is this a Bonhoeffer moment to say, when hasn't it been a Bonhoeffer moment? So from living through the 60s and the 70s, from being at Kent State University on May 4th, to the Great Boycott, to the nuclear build-up movement against that, to racism, so I think we need to change our thinking to wake up. It's always a Bonhoeffer moment, and we all have to answer that for ourselves. And what I learned from Bonhoeffer through video and for you, it's about us as a community recognizing that and then supporting one another in that.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Thank you.
I want to ask a question about Bonhoeffer's inner thinking about something. It's a difficult question. I'm not quite certain about how much he was involved in the conspiracy, but I want to leave that aside, assuming that he was. Did he ever try to reconcile his actions and thoughts with Jesus' teachings to love your enemies?
So, thank you. So I think so let me say a couple things. So on one hand, there's debate right now in the scholarly world, the Bonhoeffer world, around whether it's appropriate to talk about him as a pacifist based on his new thinking after he met Jean Lasserre, the student in France, or whether to talk about him having a peace ethic. And so, and maybe it's splitting hairs, because the thing is that for a long time people said, well, sure, after Bonhoeffer came back from New York, he moved from someone who would have probably argued for some kind of just war theory to someone who was a pacifist. And if that's the case, when he got involved in the conspiracy, he broke those commitments, right? He violated the commitments that would be associated with pacifism. And so there was this huge rupture. On the other hand, if you think about his commitment to loving one's enemies, and for Lasserre, and for true pacifists, there's no exception to that. I mean, Lasserre would have never gotten not involved in the conspiracy because it would have violated that set of commitments. But for Bonhoeffer, and in fact, in that letter, the letter that I wrote, or that I read at the beginning, that he wrote on July 21st, 1944, the day after the last failed, the group had 3 attempts, it was the last failed attempt. At the beginning, he references Jean Serre. And he's writing to his friend Eberhard, and he says, 13 years ago, I met a French pastor who wanted to become a saint. And he said, and I think he probably did become one. So thinking along these lines of pacifism, he said, it occurred to me at the time, he said, I thought at the time that that's not what I wanted. I wanted to learn to have faith. He said, at the time, I didn't really understand the difference. But he said, now, and then he goes on to say, this is around the barn of an answer to your question. He goes on to say, I think I wrote discipleship as an end to that goal, right, to learn to have faith. He said, I see the dangers in that book now. In other words, he says, if people read the book Discipleship and think of it as like a checklist, like here are the things I have to do to be a Christian, or, he said, that's dangerous. He said, I stand by what I wrote in that, but you can't read it like that. So he said, this is where he moves into thinking about faith as this sort of holistic understanding of living your life in the world. And so I think he just got practical. That loving your enemies wasn't going to solve the problem for the people who were being victimized by the state. And that's when he started talking about responsible action. And that's a very thick concept. So if you go into his ethics, you have to sort of, what he means by responsible action is it's a very thick theological concept that is related to his Christology, it's related to his Christ existing as community, it's related to grace. I mean, all of those pieces are part of what that means to take responsible action. And it's on behalf of others. And so I think at the end, what's your hermeneutic? What's your key? What's the thing where you start with? And for eventually, the loving your enemies thing wasn't going to be enough to help the people who needed help. And so he took a different course. But I do think, so was he a pacifist at the end? I guess not. Is there continuity from the beginning to the end of his life in his theology? I think there's continuity, but those are different. Does that answer your question?
It sure does.
Okay.
So being here, thanks for teaching us. Does Bonhoeffer have any depth to the Catholic theology of tyrannicide? And does Dietrich Bonhoeffer come out of that pool of Catholic theology on tyrannicide?
Repeat the question. So the question is, does Bonhoeffer have any debt to the Catholic thinking about tyrannicide? And would Colonel von Stauffenberg have any connection to that? So I for sure cannot answer the question about Colonel von Stauffenberg. I don't know his story well enough to answer that question. I do know that Bonhoeffer did pose the question to some of his students, some of his colleagues, that had come out of the seminary, about what they thought about tyrannicide. But at the end of the day, at the end of the day, he did not rely on an argument for tyrannicide to justify his actions. What I said before was that he maintained that his participation in the conspiracy required him to take on guilt, that in taking on that role, he was sinning. So I don't think, it's not the same as, he wasn't trying to justify his action. He said, when I act on behalf of others in this way, I take on guilt and I sin. And I have to rely on a forgiving God, a God who grants me grace in that venture. But he also felt called by God to do that work. I think they felt like they had, again, we talked about this, right? That to act was to sin and to not act was to sin. One of his sister-in-laws in one of the older documentaries describes the decision as cutting off the head of the snake, that other forms of resistance were just tantamount to stepping on the tail, and that if they were going to actually stop the atrocities, they had to cut off the head. So that's a graphic image to read with you.
I have another graphic story. And I've sometimes thought of it this way and presented it to somebody the other day, and they raised the question. If a person really loves dogs and really loves children, but finds themselves in a situation in town where a mad dog is running down the street toward 20 children, does the man or the person have a responsibility to shoot the dog or to respect life and see what happens? I think sometimes ethics are very complicated and we're often caught in the moment to make some kind of action that comes right out of our gut, not really out of our head or even out of our theology, because we know that there are levels of value, and I think Bonhoeffer knew that, and that he made the choice to kill the mad dog because he saw the destruction of society down at the end of the street.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I say something? Can you hear me from back here?
Yes, please.
It kind of occurred to me that part of loving our enemies is also doing what we can do that's best in their best interest. And it's really not in the best interest of any criminal to allow them to continue to commit crimes. Which might kind of lead one to think about why did God, according to Bible scripture, destroy the world with the flood? In those times, the world had become so corrupt. And yet, you look into 1 Peter 3, and you see that Jesus, after he had died and taken on a spiritual body, he descended into the prison where those people had been held since the flood. And so it's as if, I used to think that, oh, well, you know, they all went to hell because the flood took them out. But to see that passage sort of reframes things, that maybe there is an intervention that is needed, and on the surface, it looks like not the path to take because it seems to be in conflict with something else, which is also kind of akin to the dilemma that the character, now I forget his name, in the bottom of Magneto, when he was standing there ready for war and he saw his family members on the other side. And Krishna had to tell him and educate him that you just need to do your job in this world, whatever that is, and not be, and not let the distractions keep you from doing that.
Thank you. I mean, to this point and to some of the other points, I think that one of the difficult things about this story or about so many other stories is that, again, that discernment piece. So we can take all of these lessons, we can read and reflect, and yet at the end of the day, we still have to decide what it is we're going to do, what we're called by God to do. In Bonhoeffer's ethics, most ethics, the main question is, what does it mean to do good? That's sort of the ethical question. Bonhoeffer said that's not, for him, that was not the main question. For him, and again, in that sort of secular age that he was naming, right, an age where people were not necessarily religious as a given, he said, the ethical question is, what is the will of God? And again, the question, what that means then, we can translate that. What does it mean in this time, in this place, with this particular set of circumstances in front of me that I'm called to do? How do these people make an ethical demand on me, and how do I respond? And there's a great documentary. So if you want to know more about Bonhoeffer, I think the best documentary is one by Journey Films, which is called Bonhoeffer. Martin Doblmeier is the producer, and there's an interview in that film with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and it's a really short little piece, but he says, you know, the thing is, he's kind of smiles. He's kind of a charming. He's a very charming man, right? And he kind of has this sort of chuckle, and he says, "There's never going to be a shaft of light that comes shining down on you and says, 'Yes, my child, this is it.'" Like, oh, and so you're like, okay, well, then it's still really hard work to figure out, you know, in all of those situations, what it is, again, that we're called to do. And as you mentioned in the back, right? I mean, we really could argue that every moment, based on Bonhoeffer's own theology, that every moment is a Bonhoeffer moment. And so, you know, what does that mean, right? As a rule of law.
I have a question. It's probably a more personal question because of your knowledge of what went on in the Nazi time and how things became from little subtle things to awful things. Do you feel there's any parallels with some of the stuff that's going on now? Subtle stuff that is getting less and less subtle, and then, you know, when you talk about making church a national church, I'm not scared to death about that stuff, but I just wanted to be
So on one hand, I'm going to say that we have to be careful when we make parallels between historical times and our present time. On the other hand, we have to be careful not to miss clues. And so there are parallels. So we could talk about ways that fascists and dictators take over, and one of the ways is by undermining the press and the truth, by questioning the truth, by making a particular version of the truth the only, you know, reliable source. So I think that's a big set of warning red flags. And then I think, you know, if we the rise in hate crimes that have happened in the last 2 years, and I think actually, I'll just be candid. I think the board members, in part, this was part of the motivation for this series, was sort of noticing what the current administration has opened up and allowed as okay, you know, I mean, and so, yes, let me just say that if we go back, I mean, I'll be a little bit bolder, right? So, one of the things, if we go back to the lessons that Bonhoeffer learned in New York, if we learn about the ways he learned to recognize his own privilege and recognize institutional systems of oppression, you know, those things have not changed. And so, and if anything, I mean, I don't want to look for a silver lining because there isn't really one in what's happening, but the reality is that what is happening has broken open a reality that has always been there. Yes. And so now I think a lot of us, in a lot of ways, like in my institution at Augsburg, we're having a lot of serious conversation about racism, anti-racism, cultural competency, you know, things that we've kind of been doing a little bit along the way, but we're doing it with a more vigor and passion now. And so I think, you know, so it's not okay. And if you read the article that Reggie and I put together, we talked about this. Look, this language of "Make America Great Again" resonates with language of German nationalism about "Make Germany Great Again." And what are we talking about when we talk about that? I mean, we refer to it as a longing for Mayberry. Well, you know, Mayberry left a lot of people out of the conversation, and it was not a good place for lots of people to be. And I know that in the last 5 weeks you've been hearing a lot of stories and been talking about this in more sort of on-the-ground ways. And so I'd like you to think about that in terms of this larger conversation tonight about Bonhoeffer. So yeah, I think there are some things that we need to take very seriously, so it presses the question. So if every moment's a Bonhoeffer moment, if this is a Bonhoeffer moment, if Bonhoeffer's example of taking action and resisting is something that we need to follow after, then what does that look like in our own context and in our own ways? So
Maybe I'm not the only one who's looking right next to me. Could you tell us the name of the documentary again?
yeah, the documentary is called Bonhoeffer. It's produced by Journey Films, and the producer is Martin Dodelmeier. So if you look up any combination of those things, you can find it. And it's a combination of interviews, archival footage, quotes by Bonhoeffer, that kind of thing.
Thank you, Dr. Hale. Expose you to some realities in our own community, and at the same time challenge you to ask that question. Are we at a point where we need to stand up, whether as a church, as a faith community, as individuals, and take action as we have been challenged to do by our speakers? We believe we are at that moment when it comes to hate crimes and racial issues within our country. So I hope you will leave here. I hope you will attend other meetings that are going on. I hope in your own community you will start conversations, read books, have book clubs, and please don't just go home and say, gee, that was a nice series. Thank you.